think even beyond the sort of, is America in decline or is it rising in? I think the bigger thing I worry about is just a massive war, because I worry that the United States is going to convince itself and its adversaries that it just is incapable of countering large-scale aggression abroad.
Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. I'm Eric Edelman. I'm a contributor to the Bulwark, non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and I'm joined by my partner in all things strategy, Eliot Cohen, who's professor emeritus at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, a contributing writer to The Atlantic. Eliot, it seems like I just saw you just a couple of days ago.
Well, as a matter of fact, you did. So that little episode that we did on our emergency podcast, I just checked the YouTube numbers, and we're nearly 600,000 views, which is gratifying. Although this is not the way I particularly wanted us to get fame. But on a more serious note, I mean, I've been hearing literally from people all over the world that. On the one hand, I think shared the outrage, but are also grateful that there are those of us out there, and there are, of course, many of us who are saying this was despicable, this was shameful, this was disgraceful. There's no excuse for this. And we're glad to hear other people articulating that. One thing I do worry a bit about is you are hearing some whispering saying, well, Zelensky, should have just gone along and so on. And actually, Josh Marshall, of all people, of Talking Points Media, which is not my usual fare since he's considerably to the left, said, no. I mean, for him to have gone along with this, that would have been the whole point, that you let yourself be pistol whipped. And that's what they want to do. So which is exactly my view.
I want to welcome our guest in just a minute, because we're going to get into the whole question of America's role in the world, and we couldn't have a better guest to discuss it with. But I do think, first of all, our instinct on Friday that this was a setup, I think has been vindicated, at least indirectly, by some work one of my colleagues has done, cross-checking the posting of the various applauding X-postings by members of the cabinet with the timeline of the actual event broken down from video of archived on various news sites. And the speed with which these came out, and that the White House put out its long statement of support from cabinet members. And the real tell is that many of the X postings did not have misspellings. That it came with such speed and such alacrity that it almost had to be pre-planned.
Having said that, and I very much want to get us to our guest, the way they've reacted, Waltz, the National Security Advisor, Rubio in particular, I think they're feeling defensive.
Absolutely.
At the moment. I think they were not prepared for the kind of storm of criticism that they've gotten universally, for the Europeans rallying around. But I think for Americans, both, people like us shouting into the ether, but I suspect also they're probably hearing from quietly, of course, from some of the people on their own side, politicians, maybe business people, maybe others. They certainly, got it full in the face from the Wall Street Journal, which is not usually hostile to them. So I think that they may have been a bit taken aback by that.
No question. And I think, they're now gaslighting everybody by saying what you saw on TV was not what really happened. Read the whole transcript, because then you'll see how rude and how, argumentative Zelensky was, when in fact, I think anyone who reads the transcript or watches the whole video, can see that he was being incredibly, actually, I think, restrained, polite, respectful, et cetera, and said thank you 3 times at the outset of the meeting, J.D. Vance to the contrary notwithstanding. To our guest, welcoming back to Shield of the Republic, Michael Beckley, who is who's associate professor of political science at Tufts University and also a non-resident fellow at AEI in Washington, D.C., and has other titles as well. Michael was on, I guess it was 2 years ago now, with Hal Brands to discuss the book he and Hal did 2 years ago on Danger Zone. He's also the author of Unrivaled, a book that I have a lot of fondness for because it argues a point I've long maintained, which is the United States remains essentially the sole superpower and really without rival in the world. And he's the author of The Strange Triumph of a Broken America, which appears in the current issue of Foreign Affairs. Michael, welcome back to Shield of the Republic.
Thanks so much for having me, Eric and Eliot. It's great to see you guys. I just wish it was under better circumstances, but we'll do the best we can.
So, Michael, your article, which is terrific, talks about the paradox of American power. That, according to various pundits, we're perpetually in decline, yet we always seem to emerge from whatever the momentary problem is, whether it's civil war or Vietnam or what have you, stronger and more dominant economically. And I'd like you, if you could, for our listeners and viewers, to sketch out a little bit of the argument and some of the underlying data that you rely on that actually shows just how much further ahead we are of other countries economically right now in terms of global share of GDP and other metrics that you use.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the main paradox I focus on in the article is just, on the one hand, most Americans think the country's going in the wrong direction. And as you guys were already surmising, there's so many reasons why the nation just looks completely shambolic, whether it's in foreign policy or domestic policy. But if you step back and look at the big indicators of wealth and power that really, frankly, drive the rise and fall of great powers and determine who wins big wars and comes out ahead in international disputes, the United States is still doing remarkably well despite all of the domestic dysfunction. So it's really, to this day, it's still the only great power that combines both gigantic economic size, but also a very high level of per capita wealth and efficiency. China, India are also big, but they're much poorer on a per capita basis, much less efficient. Whereas the European powers and Japan are quite wealthy, but they're still nowhere near the size of the continental crushing economy of the United States. And I think the most important statistics are the ones that have shown resiliency. So the fact that the US economy still accounts for about 26% of global GDP. That's been the same with the one exception of the post-World War II period where it was 50%. It's been the same since like 1880, basically. And this was the same in the 1990s when we were supposedly living in a unipolar moment when the United States could do whatever it wanted. I found it shocking that as recently as 2008, the US and the Eurozone were basically the same economic size, but today the American economy is almost twice as large as that of the Eurozone. It's 30% larger than the entire so-called global South. If you add up all of the economies in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, still quite a bit smaller than the US economy. And then the Chinese economy is shrinking now relative to that of the United States in current dollar terms, which I think is the measure that we should all be using, because that's how much money, purchasing power, basically countries have on international markets. They're not going to be competing in terms of haircuts and noodle shops. It's going to be in terms of things like jet engines and rare earths and other things that are priced on international markets. And this is using Chinese economic data, which we know drastically overstates the size of the economy. So when you just look across the board, the US economy is still enormous. And then it gets even better when you look at per capita wealth, because the US, even though economic growth hasn't exactly been stellar, is pulling ahead of all the other rich economies. So when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, Japanese citizens were about 50% richer than American citizens were. And I remember people lavishing praise on the Japanese and thinking we had to throw our entire economic model out the door. But today, Americans are 140% richer than the average Japanese citizen. Japan would be the poorest state in the United States, poorer than Mississippi. The same is true for France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. So I could go on, and maybe that's what we should do here, but that's just kind of a table setting exercise for even other areas of continued US dominance, despite all these things that the United States is doing that seem completely shambolic.
So let me ask you, what do you think accounts for the prevalence of the declinist narrative? One which I think we should point out is shared by people in the Trump administration. If you look at Secretary of State Rubio or Bridge Colby, who's likely to be the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, the arguments are, the world's gotten a lot more difficult. We don't have the resources we used to. So we have to just concentrate in Asia and so on. Plus, you have all the so-called restrainers and so forth. So why do people get it wrong?
I think there are some legitimate reasons. So one is if you look at, say, the local balance of power in the Taiwan Strait, China has made major inroads there with its massive military build out, and the fact that just the nature of military technology, precision guided munitions and drones just make our big bases on Okinawa extremely vulnerable. So that there's facts like that. There's the fact that you have this urban rural divide where there are parts of the United States that have really been hollowed out over the last 20 or 30 years. But I think the big structural reason, because you're right, this isn't the first time that you've had this huge wave of declinism in the United States. In fact, that seems to be the default psychology of Americans. I think it just has to do with, we look at the past with rose tinted glasses and we assume that everything was great. We forget, say, the 1970s and the stagflation and the hostage crisis and the oil crisis and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And then because we're living in the present moment, all of the major setbacks that we have are just in our face every single day. The 24-hour news cycle just beats it into our brains as well. So I think there's just this natural psychological tendency to assume that things are bad. And Samuel Huntington said 40 years ago that that's why the United States doesn't decline, is because Americans always think they're in decline, and so they'll rally and kind of get their act together. I actually worry that we do so much self-flagellation that we don't invest in the kind of capabilities we need to take on these adversaries at a very dangerous moment. But that's something we can get into. But I think there's just a basic psychological issue going on here with.
If I could just make one, historical point here. So 15 years ago, when I wrote my little paper for CSBA on understanding America's contested primacy and addressed this whole question of declinism that you and Michael have been talking about, Eliot, I pointed out that we have had people in America saying that we are in decline literally since the Puritan divines had been here for about 50 years, in the 17th century. And the Jeremiad, of course, is a, sort of hardy American perennial in which Americans decry the fact that they're in decline. So this is deeply in American DNA.
It's not just American DNA. My favorite source when I talk about this is a book by a man who knew the United States very well and wished it well, Raymond Aron. A book called The Imperial Republic, which I think was published in like 1972. And in it, he says, okay, the United States was great. They really kind of saved us during the war and the Cold War period, but now they really are washed up. And,
it's over now. Yeah.
They'll be, they're in decline. The Russians are in decline. Europe will be basically okay. Kind of a pity about the United States. And of course, he was wrong. You do point to, you do call it a broken United States. So, it's, and you point to some of our internal difficulties. Part of that is the rural-urban divide. One thing you don't really talk about, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts about this. What about wealth and income distribution? Do you think that's a serious issue, and inequality? And again, just impressionistically, without looking at the data, it seems to me that inequality, wealth and income inequality has grown a lot, but maybe I'm wrong. And does it matter?
It certainly feels like it has. You look around and you see the stratification anytime you go to, I live just outside New York City, and you can see not just the income stratification, but the racial de facto segregation I see in New York City schools, for example. You can literally just glance at a school and know, the vast majority of the students are going there of particular races. And so it's clearly there's a lot of embedded inequalities. And I think that is a reflection of both an enduring weakness of the United States, but also stems from some of the factors that make the economy innovative overall. So the fact that you kind of have this open free market system allows for a lot of entrepreneurship and innovation, but it also doesn't provide much of a corrective for longstanding inequalities. It doesn't help people as much as, say, some of the Western European democracies if they fall through the cracks to get back on their feet. So I think that's just one de facto outcome. Now, there is this big debate going on among economists. I know I'm not supposed to look at the data yet, but there's been a number of studies coming out recently that suggest the long-standing narrative we've had of just expanding income inequality isn't quite correct. That in fact, when you adjust for taxes and transfers and do the calculations properly, it hasn't increased. I don't have the economic chops to fully evaluate that, but I was struck that in the last 5 or 6 years, you've seen a narrowing of, you've basically erased about a third of the income inequality that is built up, even if you measure it by the standard that makes it look like the gap is massive, just over the last 5 or 6 years, because people at the bottom of the distribution have seen faster wage gains. But I take your point. I still think there are massive inequalities. The urban-rural divide is one, but you see it even just within rural areas, obviously.
Yeah. You know, the one thing I have to say I always notice, I go to Europe, the guys driving the taxis are well-dressed, multilingual, sophisticated people. In the United States, they're frequently recent immigrants just kind of getting by, and and frequently the cabs aren't nearly as well maintained as in Europe. And I'm, I at first I think that's a pity. Why couldn't it be more like Europe? And then there's another part of me that says that actually is probably a reflection of a more dynamic economy when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I would love a bunch of other things that go on in Europe, like the trend towards a 4-day work week and,
Right.
taking multiple vacations. But after I looked at just even the productivity numbers, the per capita
Yeah.
income numbers, I think Americans like their vastly larger average incomes compared to
Yeah.
the Europeans.
It'd be
Yeah.
nice to have decent trains, though. But
Fair enough. As a rider of Amtrak, I'm all for that as well. I take that
right.
every week, and half the time I'm delayed, but that's the way it goes.
I may be able to help you on that. I've got a family connection to Amtrak. So on the article, you do a great job, I think, Michael, talking about U.S. Assets, and you see, kind of three big ones: geography, kind of land. I mean, we're a massive transcontinental nation, protected by two oceans, but also connected by two oceans to global patterns of commerce. Demography, the fact that, unlike other countries, including Russia and China, which have huge demographic problems, or even, some of our allies in Asia or Europe who face, birth rates plunging below replacement, we're still pretty healthy demographically, including, though, because we have had immigration historically. We've been a country of immigration. And then our decentralized political institutions. But you also point out that these very strengths also become kind of liabilities as our nation has progressed through history. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think on the one hand, having a vast, huge geography with dynamic demographics, bringing in thousands upon thousands of people every single year, and then having these decentralized institutions that, I know states can throw up a lot of red tape, but at least overall, if you compare the U.S. economy to what's going on in Western Europe, for example, there's just a lot less bureaucracy on average to fight through. As you said, that's great for innovation, but it leads to these two major vulnerabilities. One is that for the areas that don't integrate with a thriving global economy in the same way that, say, the most innovative urban areas do, they're going to get left behind. And so I was looking at data and then also visiting a lot of these urban or these rural areas where 20 to 30% of their economy was dependent on one major manufacturing plant. And so when that thing got offshored, it just crushed the entire main street of the economy. And same thing with public sector jobs, which after the Great Recession and then the pandemic, those had to be cut back. And so you're talking about a huge hole driven, and then the younger people that are looking for jobs move out. And so you get depopulation. And so it's this vicious cycle that feeds on itself, and it widens this urban-rural divide, which I focus on because that is also politically explosive, because our system gives it empowers these rural areas politically because a lot of their power is apportioned by land rather than population, but it hurts them economically, and so it creates these grievances. But then people that can actually make a difference, in terms of our electoral outcome. So I think that's one major longstanding vulnerability. Obviously, this came into play with the Civil War, which was in part, you had this industrialized North and an agrarian slaveholding South. And I think political economy issues played a role in addition to just obviously the moral clash over slavery. So we've seen this before, and it's really the only exception after World War II the rest of the world, the major economies are reduced to rubble. And so the US manufacturing economy really goes into overdrive, and that spread factories across town and country. But since the 1990s, when we've entered hyperglobalization, you've seen again the shriveling of a lot of these rural areas. So that's one major weakness that I think threatens the core of our institutions. The other major weakness is this, what I call hollow internationalism, that basically, we, as Zelensky and as you were pointing out before we got live here, being separated by oceans is a wonderful thing because you have this insulation from foreign threats, but it also breeds a sense of detachment from what's going on the Eurasian landmass, where most of the major geopolitical events are going on. And so as a result, Americans tend to chronically underinvest in big military power and diplomatic capabilities to really alter local balances of power in Eurasia. But at the same time, Americans are loath to kind of scale back their ambitions abroad because you have this open system, this diverse population. And so you have all of these interest groups that have avenues to lobby the US government to basically have a policy on every single international issue. And so the result is an America that still seeks to lead in so many areas around the world, still wants to throw its weight around, but often lacks the resources in specific balances of power to fully achieve its goals. And so as a result, as Eliot wrote the book, The Big Stick, obviously, oftentimes the United States is talking very loudly, but the stick that it's bringing to the fight is nowhere near big enough to really deal with the problem. I think the most obvious example is with China, but we did the same thing with Russia, where we doubled the size of NATO over the course of the 90s and 2000s, but cut our troop presence in Europe in half, and then obligated our NATO friends to focus on counterterrorism for a while. And so we sort of provoke Russia, but then don't sort of reinforce the deterrent against it. That's just one of many examples of this hollow internationalism at work, I think.
If only we'd had a commission that, warned Americans that they needed to spend more on defense,
Somewhat self-serving remark, but true. So I don't know, maybe if we could bring it a little bit closer to the present moment. I can imagine that if you had, well, I'll just put it this way. If you had a normal presidency, better or worse, center left or center right, they, would look at Beckley and say, oh, okay, so I guess that means it's from an international relations point of view, as well as domestic point of view, it'd be good if we could correct the rural-urban divide, and so on. What happens when you have an administration that really seems like determined to wreck our alliances, and would like to shut off illegal immigration for sure, but maybe not just illegal immigration, which have been, one of our sources of strength, create tariffs so, that openness to the world no longer exists. Maybe the one way to frame the beginning of this part of the discussion is just how much damage do you think the Trump administration can do? And if you have a view about how much it will do, that would be interesting too. But at the moment, I'm more interested in how, to what extent these strengths are really dependent on an administration that understands them, and how much damage can they do?
One of the things actually that struck me, Michael, about your article was precisely the point you make about the decline of public sector jobs in rural areas that has been a contributing factor to the divide. But if anything, this administration seems to be going after, the public sector in a big way. It wants to destroy the public sector if it could. And there are a lot of, Eliot and I, keep, teasing that we're going to do a big show at one point about some of the ideas that are floating around, behind all this, cultivated by Peter Thiel and J.D. Vance and other tech bros in Silicon Valley of, getting rid of the government entirely, or techno, I don't know what you call it, techno monarchism, but, moving away from democracy. As, Peter Thiel famously said, freedom and democracy no longer compatible, just get rid of the government. But that's going to disproportionately hit some of these rural areas, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a good example of why I worried about Samuel Huntington's advice saying we should think we're in decline so that we stay active. This seems to be the opposite response of this very defeatist attitude, which is ironic given that Trump tries to portray this macho, I'm going to make America great again. But the message that his administration sends is, we can't compete in multiple theaters internationally. The government is terrible and maybe even evil, and so we should just smash it. And so it triggers this overreaction that throws the baby out with the bathwater. Like, I think there's probably a lot of inefficiency in the government, and it's really great to go through with a fine tooth comb, try to weed it out. But that doesn't seem to be what's happening. It seems like we're just destroying government. Same thing, internationally. There's well-documented cases of allied free riding. There's well-documented cases of trade partners cheating on their commitments, and so there may be a role for playing a little tough on the burden sharing issue, or raising retaliatory tariffs on certain trade partners. But what we're seeing is just across the board, friend and foe. It doesn't really matter. You're going to get slapped with tariffs. Something like immigration. I agree that maybe letting hundreds of thousands of people into the country, without a plan for how to assimilate them is probably a bad idea. But the only reason the United States is the only major power that has a working age population that is set to grow throughout this century is because of immigration. And so if you cut that off, you're squeezing the human capital of the system. So across the board, there's just all these examples of, yeah, maybe in the short term you can smash and grab and eke out a little bit more wealth and power there, but you're undermining the broader structural strengths of the country. And I think the most important point is the damage that this is doing to, I know we're not supposed to call it the liberal order because that's pretentious and stupid and whatever, but I think we take for granted the fact that we live in an open trade order where any country, small, big, can plug and play, and that countries don't have to defend all of their supply chains, and that they don't have to militarize and defend their borders. I mean, that world is rapidly going away with the signals that the Trump administration is sending, that we're in a predatory jungle, and everyone just has to take matters into their own hands. That's a terrible signal to send. And while the United States might do better in a relative sense, just given its geographic and demographic and other advantages, it's just going to occupy a much nastier world that I think will make Americans poorer and less safe in the long run.
But I mean, to put a fine point on it, how much, your basic argument is that the underlying strengths of the United States are extraordinary, and if nobody interferes with them too much, will carry us forward to as actually Sam Huntington himself said, the 20th century was the American century. The 21st century will be the American century. The question is the structure so robust that even Donald Trump can't screw it up?
No. I mean, nothing is guaranteed. This is certainly, there's no determinism here. The United States, it's like having a sports team where you have a bunch of stars, you have a great training facility, you got a great youth team. But if you have terrible coaching that makes horrendous decisions over and over again, and you stoke the competitive fires of your adversaries, and you let them get together and collude against you, and you actually facilitate that collusion yourself.
I think you just described the New York Rangers.
Yeah. As someone who lives just outside of New York City, I've been watching all the teams kind of pull.
I was going to say, as somebody who hates the Yankees, it means that there's hope. But,
yeah, exactly. Or I'm from California originally. I look at a state that has so much going for it, and yet there's so many problems there. So you can easily screw up a structurally sound situation. And I think even beyond the sort of, is America in decline or is it rising again? I think the bigger thing I worry about is just a massive war, because I worry that the United States is going to convince itself and its adversaries that it just is incapable of countering large scale aggression abroad. And as a result, you're going to get a horrible deterrence failure. And we've seen this throughout American history where, we pull our troops out of Korea and say, yeah, we're not going to defend the Korean Peninsula. Turns out we still are going to come rushing back in the end. Or same thing with the Gulf War. We don't really do a whole lot to deter Saddam Hussein, but then we're going to fight anyway. And then that puts our troops in Saudi Arabia, which angers bin Laden and Al Qaeda, and results in 9/11. And then we end up invading Iraq. And so it causes all these knock-on effects when we probably could have nipped these problems in the bud with a more vigorous assertion of our deterrent power. If you're talking about a multipolar world and American carnage, and the United States is just another power and we should be having spheres of influence and colluding with the Russians and the Chinese, you're opening the door for this kind of opportunistic aggression. And I think Americans at the end of the day won't stand for that. And so you're just going to come rushing back in at much greater cost than you could have if you just nipped the problem in the bud.
If I could just follow that up, because you make a broader argument in this, but also quite powerfully in other writings that the real danger in the world is declining powers. At that point where they begin to see that they're declining, that's when they lash out. So I was wondering if you could describe for our listeners the broad outlines of that argument.
Yeah.
Um,
So, yeah. Go ahead.
yeah, and then we should obviously talk about Russia and China. I mean, I'd be interested in your sort of fine-grained assessment of decline in both cases, because I think you think, and I tend to agree, that both are declining.
Yeah, this is actually a very common argument that's been made by many scholars in international relations. It's never the countries that are still rising and gaining in wealth and power and prestige that decide to launch a war, because why would they? Everything's going their way. Countries are currying favor with them left and right. They're making all kinds of territorial and other concessions to get access to their booming economy or just to stay out of the way of a rising power on the make. But it's the ones where they start looking ahead and they either see adversaries building up and encircling them, or maybe their own domestic economy starts to run out of steam. And that's when they start to say, well, look, it's not like the game is up. We're not doomed to decline. So we're not going to abandon our sky high ambitions to have our moment in the sun and take back lost territories or become a global power. Instead, if we have fewer economic carrots to offer other people, if we can't buy concessions from other countries, well, we can always take this to the military domain, where, by the way, we've built up this massive military machine during our rising period. So the rise creates these high ambitions and a lot of military power, but the fear of future decline causes these countries to move more aggressively, because otherwise they have to worry that the situation is just going to get worse for them. There's so many examples. The most obvious is Germany before World War I, or the Japanese before World War II. I put Putin's Russia in that category. In the 2000s, when the Russian economy is growing at 7 to 8%, he's musing about maybe joining NATO and making nice. But when the economy starts to slide after the 2008 financial crisis, the drop in commodity prices, China's slowdown, which led to a drop in demand for a lot of Russian goods, that's when his hold on power at home starts to slip, and his ability to corral former Soviet states goes down as well. He tries to create this Eurasian Economic Union. People aren't very enthusiastic about it, most famously the Ukrainians. So you see this pattern time and again. I think Russia has already gone down this trap, and I worry very much about the Chinese. And again, it's not that they're saying, woe is me, we're done for, and so we have to just lash out violently. It's more just, we have fewer carrots to buy off opposition, but we do have this huge military. So why wouldn't we take it to that realm? I think that partially explains why you've seen them become much more aggressive in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea.
I mean, it also speaks to something that social psychologists have shown about human nature, which is obviously I'm talking about Kahneman and Tversky and prospect theory, which is people are much more inclined to take risks to preserve what they think they've already gained, as opposed to speculative gains that they might make by taking risk.
Absolutely. Yeah. Prospect theory, I think, is a big part of this, especially for dictators too. Like Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, they don't strike me as guys who want to go down as the ones who presided over the steady erosion of the great Russian and Chinese empires to second rank status. And so, when Putin has a bad COVID experience sitting around surrounded by statues of Catherine the Great and kind of pondering his role in history, I wonder how much that plays into their risk acceptance. And hopefully Xi Jinping will have more humility, but nothing he's done strikes me as a particularly humble guy. And the idea that you hate to lose what you feel you already have more than you care about gains, I think is worth considering.
But I mean, I wonder. Actually, it's a question for you, Eric, as well. Do you think that Putin and Xi Jinping think that they are in decline? I mean, I think they certainly believe the United States is in decline, and I think certainly in the case of Putin, maybe in the case of Xi, I don't know. Part of that judgment is formed by a kind of cultural judgment about the West, that it's decadent and so forth. But I think they, I am not sure that Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping think their own countries are declining. Do you? I mean,
No, so I think it's the common in Xi Jinping's case. I think the sort of Marxist narrative of you're gonna have to struggle to get to the promised land, to get to the utopia. Things are going to get tough. And when you get close, that's when the capitalist imperialist powers are going to be especially vicious and engage in all around encirclement. And so if you do nothing, if you just rely on the invisible hand of the free market, you're going to get buried over time. But if you push hard, if you militarize and have the largest military buildup since Nazi Germany, if you throw your weight around, these democracies, they're decadent, they're hedonistic. We're seeing that they're increasingly divided. They don't have the stomach or the stamina to engage in a protracted competition. And at the end of the day, their institutions are so divided, they can't really mobilize in the same way that we as an autocratic power can. So I think it's this combination of, if we push hard, then we will succeed. But if we just kind of sit back and see where the chips fall, right now, with a slowing economy, or, Xi Jinping has given multiple public speeches where he's talked about this, the all around encirclement that he's seen from the West, and the hostility and the need to really shore up China's self-reliance and its comprehensive national power. So it's this blend, which I think makes just a lot of sense, of some confidence, but also fear that if you don't get moving, that things will probably get worse in the future.
Yeah, I think it's also, I mean, Michael, correct me if you think I'm wrong here, but I think, to Eliot's question, it's also the issue is also relative versus absolute decline. And if you have painted very expansive objectives, and in the case of Xi, building on Mao's statement that China has stood up and that China is going to assume its rightful place in the world, which we all know Chinese believe is at the center of the world. And you're going to do it by 2049. And suddenly the economy starts to slow up. And instead of catching the American economy and passing it, as people thought China would do 10 years ago, you find the gap growing, as you point out in your article. Same with Putin. Putin, I think, when ironically, after the war in Iraq, when oil prices shot up and suddenly the government of Russia, which had basically 6 years earlier been defaulting, is now sort of flush with cash, and he can envisage a much bigger role for Russia, as opposed to the afterthought that it was in the early 2000s. But then everything slows up, and then the United States starts, going further, including in the aftermath of COVID, bouncing back much more quickly than everybody else. I mean, in terms of who his advisors were, I mean, Lavrov has famously said to people that after Putin went into sort of occlusion as a result of COVID, and was sort of, as you say, Michael, musing about Russian history and presumably his legacy. Lavrov was asked, who are his advisors. He says his closest advisors are Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and Ivan the Terrible.
It's a terrifying thought, and I think you're right. Everything, you've both been in government, and you'll know that it's just a lot easier to govern when the economy is going well. The economy is not the sole determinant. I think for dictators, geopolitical factors are ultimately what matters most. But when the gravy train is hunting, it's a lot easier to keep the people happy. It's a lot easier to run your patronage system. You don't have to make tough decisions about which of these elite constituencies you're going to buy off. But when the times get tough, you're going to pay the guys with the guns first, and so in fact, you're going to overpay them because you need them to protect you from all the other people who are going to be upset as the times get tough. The lying flat generation of young people who can't find jobs commensurate with their skills, the state-owned enterprises that are going bankrupt, that you can no longer just bail out willy-nilly. Obviously the private entrepreneurs that you've throttled recently to try to, because you put your state-owned enterprises ahead of them in line, basically, to get the subsidies that you're still doling out. So, and then your foreign partners start to point the finger. You have this Belt and Road, but then when those projects start to go belly up, all of your partners are saying, well, now we want debt relief. And if your economy is not growing, it's hard to just continue to throw money out as a form of soft power. So everything just gets harder, and then forces you to focus on the ultima ratio, which unfortunately is the use of military power and internal security forces.
What would you say is the pace of Russian and Chinese decline? I mean, is this
So
happening very rapidly in your view?
I think Russia, because of the massive losses, and Russia was not in a healthy state prior to this conflict by any means. I mean, its demographics were atrocious. Not just the steady decline of the population overall, but just the mass exodus of high end human capital, basically the most educated people moving out. And then with the start of the war, I've seen statistics upwards of 1 million people fleeing the country, and many of them were among the most highly educated. You have a tech scene. A lot of Russian entrepreneurs are hanging out in places like Tel Aviv right now, or even in the West. So it was already looking pretty bad, and then you throw in the war in Ukraine. But that said, it's a petro state in a lot of ways. If you're pulling money out of the ground and you still have willing buyers, that's pretty powerful. And if you can then start to conquer territory and populations, you can maybe arrest some of that slide. So I think a lot depends really on the next few years in the case of Russia. If it's stymied here in Ukraine and can't advance any further through conquest, it's going to continue to shrivel as a great power. And I think its best days are clearly behind it. In China's case, it's much
Unless we rescue it,
unless we rescue
which
it.
seems to be in the cards.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, in China's case, I think it's more of a medium term slide. So, they, even though their population is now shrinking, they still have a lot of, more than 100 million military age men. So they have no problem in terms of manpower and the military. They have an enormous economy. It's smaller in dollar terms than the United States, but it's still big. And they've also pumped up a lot of these industries. And so even though the average Chinese person is seeing stagnating incomes, they are pushing ahead in a lot of these major technologies, and they've also identified what they call choke points in the global economy, things like rare earths or things like medical PPE or run-of-the-mill computer chips, or increasingly it looks like access to the South China Sea is something they also want to hold at risk and condition. So they've identified all of these choke points, and if they can consolidate control over them, then they have leverage even if their population is steadily declining and their economy is no longer growing. And so I really worry that I don't think China or Russia are ever going to rival the United States in overall wealth and power. But that doesn't make me feel that much better if they basically become giant extortion artists a la North Korea and use their coercive leverage rampantly, which they have in spades, given their economic wherewithal and obviously their nuclear weapons and their big militaries.
Do you have a take on Europe?
Europe, this is why. So I wrote an article 4.5 years ago called Rogue Superpower that basically said, don't think that if Trump gets voted out of office, I wrote this like in October 2020. And a lot of people are saying, oh, it looks like Biden's going to win the election. And when he does, America is going to be back. I said, yeah, I don't know. I think, this Trumpian phenomenon is going to continue in part because the allies are shriveling so quickly and they have massive debts. Their productivity growth is negative. Now many of them are just in extended recessions. And I don't see that getting any better because of the combination of their demographics and their very generous social welfare policies that they can no longer afford. And so their ability to ever recover, I think, is I don't want to completely write them off. They still have agency. They're still incredibly wealthy compared to the vast majority of the world, but they're never going to be what they were. I mean, I just see this continued shriveling of a lot of these classic Eurasian great powers in Western Europe and in Japan.
Let me ask you, Michael, I mean, you talk about one of our advantages being our alliances. And, look, as we sit here, today, I'm not 100% sure that, the United States, that Trump won't try and take the United States out of NATO relatively soon. I would note over the weekend that Mike Lee and others were tweeting, get the U.S. out of NATO, and Elon Musk was retweeting all this. Make of that what you will. I mean, obviously what happened, the meltdown in the Oval on Friday, that seems to be, a pretext at least for cutting off further assistance to Ukraine and then throwing the whole burden on the Europeans, whether the Europeans can do this. I mean, I think a lot of the Europeans are still nursing, I would say Starmer among them, hope against hope that somehow they can come up with this plan where they'll carry a heavy load or heavier load, but somehow the Americans will provide the enablers and the, some kind of security guarantee backup that will keep this whole, thing going. I mean, I'm skeptical, color me skeptical that Trump will do that. Um, but I mean, how do you think, these alliances are likely to survive? We're only 5 weeks into Trump. He's got another 3 years and 11 months to wreak enormous damage on America's alliances. Uh, Irreparable, or very, very bad, but possibly could be weathered, assuming a change at some point in 2029.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think absent some kind of shocking event, a massive Russian offensive that spills over into the Baltics or seizes even greater pieces of Ukraine after some kind of ceasefire has been forced onto the Ukrainians, and then Putin just blatantly violates that, or if the Europeans try to send in and put boots on the ground, as some have mused, and they get killed. I don't see the Trump administration changing course when it comes to NATO, and I think you're right to worry of them just straight up pulling out and doing, what realist international relations scholars have been calling for a long time, of turning it into basically just a museum piece, and having turning it all over to Europe. So, unfortunately, we've seen this time and again in democracies, where until your feet are really held to the fire, you tend to be extremely slow to mobilize. And despite the largest war in Europe since World War II, the fact that it hasn't affected immediately the lives of people living in even a place like Germany, let alone in Washington, D.C., or in the heartland of the United States, there's just not going to be that galvanizing effort absent that. So I think for at least the next few years with the Trump administration, these things are gonna wither on the vine. Unfortunately, it'll be interesting to see if the Europeans can get their act together. But I look at their militaries, and they can't move their militaries anywhere. They have no heavy lift, and so even if they had the political willpower, they literally just don't have the capabilities to be. They need a decade, and I don't even think that would help, because they have no money. The average debt to GDP ratio among these major European powers is over 270% at this point. And and their productivity is negative. They're getting less productive every year. Their export markets are drying up because of protectionism and the slowdown in other major economies. So they're broke, and their people have no memory of something like World War II, which I think was actually really important in helping the Western alliance emerge over the course of the Cold War. It's like we remember viscerally what happens if we screw around with this too much. Today, I think ironically, it's a problem of success, because there's been so much success in the Western world, and we've had so much prosperity and so much peace, that we are now standing strategically naked in the face of some very old school threats that are coming our way extremely quickly.
So, I think that's absolutely right. I've often thought that it's not a coincidence that this has come upon us at the same time as the last living memory of World War II has died out. People who, like my parents or Eric's parents, who remember that period and who it shaped, even if they were in the continental United States throughout the whole time. I was wondering if we could take just a brief detour. You mentioned realist international relations scholars. God bless you. You live in the middle of in the belly of the academic beast. I am thankfully out of it. In any case, SAIS was always a somewhat different kind of place because of the school's unusual traditions. So you call them realist scholars. It seems to me it's profoundly unrealistic to think that really the best thing you could do is kind of leave Europe, exercise restraint, kind of hunker down. Where does all that come from? Why to what extent do you think that some of the dominant view in the international relations world is the so-called realism and what people refer to as restraint, although there are harsher names I could give to it. So could you just do a little bit of academic sociology for us?
Yeah, I wish I knew, because this was, the basis of my education for, about 20 years. And it's only been in recent years I've started to, retake basic things like ideology seriously as a major determinant of state behavior. They're not just billiard balls bouncing off each other. And just the idea that other countries define their interests in a different way than we do. And they actually have extremely ambitious territorial interests that they want one way or another. And so it's not a question of we're provoking them into suddenly just lashing out and conquering territory. They want to do it. And it's just a question of they can pull it off. So where does it come from? I mean, part of it, when I'm sitting in the faculty lounge, I haven't really served in any kind of major capacity in government. It's really easy to be a bomb thrower, from the faculty lounge and just say, yeah, you idiot policymakers, how could you be so stupid? And it's just the nature of national security too. When we make mistakes, it's horrific things happen and they're front page news. But when we succeed, nothing happens. It's the dog that didn't bark. So there's always going to be lots of easy fodder for academics like myself to just be critical all the time and just hate on the people that are doing the best they can in extremely difficult jobs. I think, I was not, a huge proponent of the wars in the Middle East. I think in the fullness of time, when people understand the context of the decision making, I think it'll be more, there'll be less vitriol, maybe from the academy deployed against it. But I think that was also just a major motivator. I mean, someone like Barry Posen, I look at him and I think the war in Iraq, really affected him deeply. And so for him, that was, part and parcel of just, something more structural about American foreign policy. It's very similar to the sort of the Louis Hartz argument of just these Americans can't help themselves and they just want to go evangelize and spread their system, and they'll do it by the barrel of a gun. And we, the smart ones who are sitting in the ivory tower, have to be the force of restraint here. So I get where that comes from. But my fear is, when you look at the world, sometimes I've talked to them. I've said, why don't you just own this foreign policy that we're seeing today? This much more transactional foreign policy that's just trying to squeeze if what you care about is wealth and power, because that's all that matters, because countries are all the same effectively, except for their wealth and power. Why wouldn't you be a big proponent of this foreign policy that is just using every coercive tool in the American arsenal to strangle these, whether they're allies, longstanding, moral values? None of that matters. It's just transactions. So why don't you just own it and come out in favor of it?
What's the answer that you get for that?
They say, well, we distinguish, I've been pointed to Barry Posen's article, illiberal hegemony, and they say that's bad. And this is illiberal hegemony. And I say, there's nothing hegemonic. This isn't about creating an order. The Trump administration is not trying to create an order here. So it's not hegemonic. It's just primacy in a purely Machiavellian America sort of style to eke it. That's why I call it a rogue superpower. It's just pure transactions.
Yeah, it reminds me of Mayor Daley's famous comment in 1968 that the role of the police was not to create disorder; it was to preserve disorder.
Yeah. You don't want to invent the cure. You want to treat the symptoms. So why not do that?
Michael, we're coming to the end of our time, and I know that you've got to run off and teach the next generation. But given the fact that, as Eliot and I like to say, on this podcast, we have a full range of opinion from gloom all the way to doom. I'd like to thank you for injecting a little bit more optimism into our discourse than we normally have on Shield of the Republic. But your article really is terrific. It deserves a very, very large audience. I hope we've enlarged the audience a little bit today, and hope to have you back on Shield of the Republic.
Amen to that.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be with you guys. Appreciate it.